This is called the Goodnight Chorus. Even though it doesn't have a chorus, it's just a bunch of verses like a Bob Dylan song. Good night to the waitress and the regular crowd. Good night to the band that's playing too loud. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the ladies. Good night to the gents. Good night, you go-getters that got up and went. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the gypsies, the weary, the worried. Good night to the tipsy, the drowsy, the blurry. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the cowboys and the rodeo clowns, to the salt of the earth and the dust of the ground. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night, your street preacher reading from King James Dean. Good night, all you pushers and alleyway queens. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night to the voice of a lost generation, singing for tips in a dark railway station. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night, you ambitious, too big for this town. Come back when you're ready to lay some roots down. Good night to the hustlers, to the wise guys and thieves. Good night, all you skeptics and those who believe. Good night to the late crowd. Good night, early risers. Good night, all you poets. Good night, plagiarizers. Good night to the faithful. Good night to the few. Good night, all your lovers and the ones that love you. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. Good night, good night, good night to you all. Good night. I love you, everybody. My name's Jacob Johnson. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Settle down. Settle down out there. Disperse this unlawful assembly. Return to your homes. Go be with your families. Come see me in the back.